Okay, this is going to be a quick video about why I believe Black Americans will not receive reparations. For as long as I can remember, reparations have hovered at the edges of American political conversation, always whispered about, occasionally debated, but never seriously acted upon. I am Black, born and raised in America, and I say this up front, not as a disclaimer, but as context. This isn't even an academic exercise for me. This is personal. I grew up hearing the promise of it, that one day the federal government will finally acknowledge the debt owed to the descendants of the enslaved people, and that one day America will reckon with what it actually built itself on. Even recently, the nation of Ghana expressed interest in advocating on behalf of the victims of slavery at the United Nations, which gave some people renewed hope. But as time has passed, I become increasingly convinced that reparations in any meaningful federal form will not happen in my lifetime. This isn't defeatism. It's a sober look at the political, economic, and moral structural realities of modern America. The conversation I grew up with since I was little, the talk of reparations was always there, not front and center, but in the background, like a television left on in another room. It came up at cookouts, in church basements, in conversations between adults who spoke about it the way people speak about something that they want badly, but don't fully believe they'll ever have. It had the texture of hope mixed with resignation. The general feeling was, one day, the federal government will reimburse Black Americans for the centuries of uncompensated labor, for the wealth that was extracted, for the lives that were taken. But as I got older, I started paying closer attention, and the one day started feeling further and further away. Not because the cause became less just, but because the country around it kept changing in ways that made it less and less politically possible. I'll be honest, I have a smartphone in my hand, a computer at home, and a television. By certain metrics, I look like someone who, quote-unquote, made it. But I know that the difference between consumer goods and generational wealth, owning an iPhone is not the same as owning land, equity, or a business. And the distinction matters enormously when we talk about what reparations are actually trying to address. And this gets into the declining economic capacity of the average American. One of the most concrete obstacles to reparations is the financial condition of the very population that would theoretically fund them through taxes. The average American is in a far more precarious economic position than at any point in the post-World War II era. Home ownership among millennials and Gen Z, particularly white Americans who would disproportionately bear the tax burden, has collapsed. A large share of homes that do get purchased are being bought up by private equity firms and institutional investors, locking out an entire generation from one of the primary vehicles of wealth building in this country, which is owning your own home. Think about that for a minute. If you are a young white American today, not wealthy, not connected, just average, you are probably renting, probably in debt, probably watching home ownership drift further and further out of reach with each passing year. You honestly believe that person is going to vote for a reparations program? Do you honestly believe that they are going to have the political will, the economic generosity, or frankly, the financial margin to support it? Wage growth has been stagnant for decades when adjusted for inflation. Retirement savings are thin or non-existent for a large portion of the country. The economic insecurity of working and middle-class Americans is not a background condition. It is a central political reality of our time. and it works directly against the possibility of reparations. People are struggling to afford rent, groceries, and healthcare. The political appetite for redirecting federal resources toward a reparations program evaporates. Politicians understand this, which is why reparations rarely make it past rhetoric, particularly in swing districts where fiscal anxiety runs high. And now we're going to get into the moral dilemma of inherited guilt. There is a genuine and unresolved philosophical debate at the heart of reparations. Can you hold someone financially responsible for a crime they did not personally commit? The white Americans of today did not enslave anyone. Many are descendants of immigrants who arrived in this country after the Civil War, like the Irish, the Italians, Eastern Europeans, Asians, Latin Americans, who have no ancestral connection to American slavery whatsoever. For these populations, the moral logic of reparations seems genuinely unjust, not out of racial hostility, but out of a reasonable sense that they are being asked to pay a debt they did not incur. Even among those whose ancestors did benefit from slavery, the chain of causation is difficult to establish. There's a poor white family in rural America with no inherited wealth and its own multi-generational history of economic struggle own the same reparations debt as the descendants of wealthy plantation owners? Does a white American whose family immigrated from Poland in 1910 bear the same moral responsibility as someone whose great-grandfather owned a cotton plantation in Mississippi? These are questions that do not have clean answers, and in a democracy, the inability to answer them cleanly is politically fatal. There's a problem of definition. Who qualifies? This is one of the most overlooked and practically thorny issues in the entire debate, and it rarely gets the serious attention it deserves. Who exactly would qualify for reparations? The United States is an ethnically diverse nation where racial identity exists on a spectrum. Do multiracial individuals qualify? What percentage of African ancestry is required? Do recent African or Caribbean immigrants, people who came to America voluntarily and have no ancestral connection to American slavery, qualify simply because they are black? What about the descendants of free black Americans who were never enslaved? What about black Americans whose ancestors were themselves enslaved by black or indigenous peoples in West Africa before being sold into the transatlantic slave trade? These are not rhetorical questions, designed to dismiss the case. They are definitional landmines that any reparations legislation will have to navigate. The political and legal battles over eligibility alone could consume decades. There is no clean registry for slave descendants. DNA testing introduces its own complications, costs, and civil liberties concerns. The administrative architecture required to implement reparations fairly and accurately would be enormous, expensive, and deeply contentious before a single dollar is distributed. Also, America is no longer a black and white debate. This is perhaps the most underappreciated complication to the modern reparations conversation. It is one that has grown more significantly with every passing decade. The America in which reparations was seriously discussed was, politically and demographically, framed primarily as a black and white issue. That America no longer exists. The United States is now one of the most multiracial democracies on earth. Hispanic Americans are now the largest minority group in the country. Asian Americans are the fastest growing. Indigenous people, who have their own profound unresolved claims against the federal government, arguably more legally grounded than reparations for slavery, remain largely outside the conversations. Arab Americans, South Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and dozens of other communities in the political landscape exist in the political landscape where questions of who is harmed, who owes, and who gets compensated are no longer simple. The moment federal reparations for Black Americans become a serious legislative proposal, it will immediately trigger a cascade of competing claims. Indigenous communities will rightfully ask why their claims, rooted in broken treaties, stolen land, and cultural genocide with far more direct legal documentation, are being addressed after or before those of Black Americans. Hispanic Americans, many of whom carry the histories of colonization, dispossession, and labor exploitation, will ask where they fit. Some Asian American communities, particularly Chinese Americans, who route the Transcontinental Railroad under brutal conditions and were then excluded from citizenship by the Chinese Exclusion Act, will raise their own historical grievances. Even within immigrant communities, there are layers. People who came fleeing American foreign policy intervention in their home countries, economic refugees from systems destabilized in part by American corporate or military activity. None of this is to say, none of this is to create a competition of suffering. Pain is not a zero-sum game, and the horrors of slavery are singular in many respects. But politics is competitive, and in a democracy made up of increasingly mobilized minority coalitions, the question of who gets compensated and who doesn't is explosive. A reparations program specifically for Black Americans will face legal challenges under equal protection principles and political challenges from every other group that feels its own historical wounds are being ignored. Building a coalition broad enough to pass federal reparations becomes almost impossible when every minority community has a reason to either demand inclusion or feel resentment and exclusion. There is also an internal tension within the Black community itself at this point. Many Black Americans whose families immigrated from Nigeria, Ghana, Jamaica, Haiti, or somewhere else are deeply invested in Black American culture and solidarity, but may have complicated relationships with a program specifically designed for descendants of American slaves. Defining the eligible population in a way that is both historically accurate and politically defensible is an enormous challenge that has no obvious solution. The white backlash, real, organized, and growing. This deserves more than a passing mention, because the backlash, even the conversation about reparations, has become one of the most politically powerful political forces working against it, and it is only growing stronger. White backlash to racial progress is not a new phenomenon in American history. It followed Reconstruction when a brief period of Black political empowerment after the Civil War was systematically dismantled through violence, the disenfranchisement, and the imposition of racial hierarchy. It followed the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, when landmark legislation was met with white flight, the Southern Strategy, and decades of deliberate political organizing designed to roll back racial progress by framing it as government overreach. The pattern is consistent. Every time Black Americans make measurable progress towards equality, there is a powerful organized counter-movement that reframes that progress as an attack on everyone else. The modern backlash to reparations follows the same pattern, but with new tools and new intensity. Social media has given backlash a megaphone. Political media ecosystems built on outrage and racial resentment have made reparations a reliable wedge issue, something to be amplified, but because it's actually on the verge of passing, whenever the discussion of it can be weaponized to mobilize voters. Every time a prominent Democrat mentions reparations, the opposition runs ads. Every time a city or university launches a reparations pilot program, it becomes a national news story framed as government handouts, reverse discrimination, or the destruction of American meritocracy. This framing is effective, not just among voters who openly harbor racial resentment, but among moderate independent voters who have internalized the language of colorblindness. The belief that any race-conscious policy is inherently unfair, regardless of a history that produced racial inequality. For these voters, reparations don't seem as correction; they read as preferential treatment. In a political environment where fairness is understood as treating everyone equally, identically, rather than addressing historical inequality, that framing wins. The backlash also now includes voices from within certain minority communities, a fact that complicates the old black versus white narrative. Some Hispanic and Asian political commentators and politicians have publicly opposed reparations on the grounds of fairness, immigration status, or fiscal priorities. Some conservative black intellectuals and politicians have argued against reparations on the grounds of self-reliance, practicality, or the risk of further inflaming racial divisions. These voices are often amplified disproportionately by political opponents of reparations because they provide cover, a way of opposing reparations without appearing to be motivated by racial animus. Their effect, regardless of intent, is to fragment the coalition that will need to exist for reparations to advance. There's also the simple political math of the backlash in a two-party system. Reparations is not a majority position, and poll after poll, a majority of Americans, including substantial percentages of Hispanic, Asian, even some Black Americans, oppose federal reparations. Politicians in competitive districts know this. Supporting reparations can be a career-ending vote in dozens of congressional districts, and politicians in safe seats who support it rarely have the leverage to make it happen nationally. The backlash has successfully made reparations politically radioactive at the federal level, and there is no current mechanism to change that. The political infrastructure doesn't exist. Reparations require not just majority support, but a substantial political coalition with enough power to overcome Senate filibusters, constitutional challenges, and multiple election cycles of organized opposition. Black Americans make up roughly 13% of the U.S. population, even with sympathetic allies across racial lines. Building a durable filibuster-proof majority in support of federal reparations have proven impossible. Legislation has been introduced repeatedly, most notably H.R. 40, which simply calls for a study of reparations, not reparations themselves, and it has never passed. If Congress cannot even pass a bill to commission a report, the likelihood of passing actual reparations legislation is vanishingly small. The political will simply does not exist at the federal level, and given everything described above, it shows no sign of developing. The distraction of symbolic wins. Over the years, Black Americans have been offered and sometimes celebrated symbolic acknowledgments in place of material change. Juneteenth became a federal holiday. Some cities and counties launched local reparations pilot programs. Corporations issue statements, change branding, and pledge diversity commitments after high-profile moments of racial reckoning. While some of these gestures carry genuine cultural and historical significance, they also serve to discourage public pressure from delivering material retribution. These symbolic victories can actually reduce the urgency that drives political momentum for substantial change. America has become very good at honoring the idea of justice without delivering it. International precedent offers little hope. Some advocates point to Germany's Holocaust reparations program as a model, but the comparison breaks down quickly. Germany has a centralized, documented perpetrator, the Nazi state, a defined survivor population, and a concentrated historical window. American slavery spanned centuries, was carried out through a patchwork of state, federal, and private systems, and descendant populations, is now multiple generations removed from the original crime. The logistical, legal, and political conditions that made German reparations possible simply do not map clearly onto the American context. What this means. None of this is an argument that reparations are undeserved. The economic consequences of slavery, followed by decades of Jim Crow, redlining, discriminatory lending, mass incarceration, and other systemic practices, have produced a racial wealth gap that is both enormous and measurable. The moral case is real. The historical debt is real. I know this is not just intellectually, but personally, and that any Black American that's paid attention knows it. And the stories passed down, and the opportunities that never materialized, and the quiet arithmetic of what families might have had history gone differently. But moral legitimacy and political viability are two entirely separate things. America has a long and painful history of acknowledging injustice without correcting it. The gap between what is right and what gets done is wide, and it's fueled in the way of economics, identity politics, political strategy, demographic change, and the sheer inertia of a system that was never designed to redistribute what it took. Until the gap closes, there is no clear mechanism for closing it in the near term. Reparations will remain what they have always been for me, for my parents, and likely for my children. A conversation that never goes anywhere. A promised tale just far out of reach that has never been kept.